The heat had a weight that morning, pressing low upon the horizon as if the sky itself wanted to touch the earth and sleep. The sun had only just broken over the ridges, yet its light already shimmered white on the plains, bending above the long grass and broken stones. A crow cried somewhere near the dry creek bed, and its echo seemed to chase itself in circles through the still air. Dust drifted like smoke from the distance, pale ribbons twisting around the wagon that climbed the lonely path toward Coyote Bend. 2 figures sat upon that wagon. One was young and beautiful, though the kind of beauty earned by struggle rather than born of ease. The other was her mother, her face folded like the pages of an old book. The younger woman held the reins, guiding the mule forward with slow patience. The wheels creaked, spokes clicking with every uneven turn. Sweat ran down her temple and into her collar. Her name was Isolde McCrae, Izzy as her mother called her in softer moments, and she had known the taste of dust more often than bread. Since her father's death 3 winters past, she and Martha had drifted from one border town to another, living off the mercy of strangers. But mercy in the frontier was a thin cloth, it wore through quickly. Martha coughed into a rag. "Maybe we should stop a while," she said, her voice thin as a reed. Izzy didn't answer. She only looked ahead, toward the faint shape of the homestead that shimmered against the horizon, a place she'd heard of from the church women back in town. They said an Apache man lived there, alone and quiet, his land stretching from Blood Mesa to the edge of the San Pedro. They said he'd once asked if anyone knew a woman who could cook and tend to a home, that he was too often out breaking horses to keep one properly. But gossip has a way of twisting truth into opportunity. And in the silence of their hunger, Martha had taken the story as a kind of salvation. "He needs a wife," Martha had said that morning. "And you need a home." Izzy had not argued. What else was left to lose? The road narrowed into a path between rock and sagebrush. Heat shimmered so strongly that the air itself looked as if it were breathing. Izzy could feel her mother's weight swaying beside her, could hear each labored breath. The house came into view slowly, a broad wooden structure built from dark cedar, its porch shaded by a few tired boards. Horses stood tethered near the corral. There was movement beyond the porch, the outline of a man, tall, bare to the waist, working with an axe at a pile of timber. Izzy drew the mule to a stop. For a moment she couldn't move. The man's presence seemed to fill the open air around him. His shoulders glistened with sweat beneath the rising sun. Scars crossed his chest like old rivers dried by time. His hair was black, bound loosely with leather, and his eyes, when he finally looked toward them, held a quietness deeper than silence. He was the one they called Chayton Blackthorn. Izzy climbed down from the wagon, her knees trembling. The air smelled of pine and dust, and the faint sweetness of horse sweat. Her heart drummed unevenly as she walked the short distance to the porch. Each step stirred tiny clouds of red dust. Her mother waited behind her, one hand clutching her shawl tight around her frail shoulders. When Izzy reached the steps, Chayton lowered his axe and wiped his forearm across his brow. He said nothing. She swallowed, trying to steady her breath. "I was told you need a wife." The words came out smaller than she intended, breaking at the edge like a dropped plate. Chayton's expression didn't change. Only his jaw tightened slightly, the faintest movement beneath the bronze of his skin. The wind carried a dry hiss through the mesquite nearby. For a long moment he didn't speak. Then he said quietly, "I said I needed help around the ranch. Not a wife." Behind Izzy, Martha shifted, nearly stumbling from the wagon step. "Please," she said in a hoarse whisper. "We got nowhere else to go. She can cook. Clean. I can still mend, though these old hands." She broke off in a cough that bent her double. Chayton looked at the old woman, then back at Izzy. His gaze wasn't cruel, but it was guarded. The gaze of a man who had learned not to believe in words too easily. "There's not much room here," he said finally. "We don't take much," Izzy answered quickly. "A roof, that's all. I'll work hard. I can learn what you need." Her voice carried a note she hadn't meant to reveal, the quiet edge of pleading that stung her throat. Chayton said nothing more. He turned, stepped onto the porch, and disappeared through the doorway. The moment stretched like a held breath. Then the door opened again. "Bring your mother in," he said. The relief came so sharply that it hurt. Izzy hurried back to the wagon, helping Martha down. The older woman's legs trembled under her, her weight too light, her bones too close to the skin. Together, they crossed into the shade of the porch, and the cool air inside the house wrapped around them like mercy itself. The room smelled of wood oil and smoke. Sparse. A single table, a cot, a shelf lined with tools and books whose spines were cracked from sun and time. A carved eagle sat by the window, wings spread as though guarding the silence. Chayton poured water from a clay jug into 2 cups and set them before the women without a word. Izzy noticed his hands, rough, scarred, capable. She drank quickly, the coolness burning her throat. Martha sank onto a chair, her eyes half-lidded. "Thank you, sir," she whispered. Chayton inclined his head slightly, then returned to stand by the door. His presence filled the space like a mountain shadow. "You can stay a few days," he said. "Till you find another place." Izzy's heart faltered. "You mean to send us away? I don't need a wife." His tone was calm, not unkind, simply a statement of fact. "And you don't need to tie your life to a man who don't ask for it." She looked down at her hands. They were raw and pale, veins standing like small rivers under her skin. She had nothing, no dowry, no father, no kin but the woman half asleep beside her. Shame swelled in her chest, thick as tar. Martha murmured faintly, "She ain't asking for more than a chance to live decent, Mr. Blackthorne." Chayton said nothing. He stepped outside again, the door creaking behind him. Through the window, Izzy could see him standing under the sun, lifting his axe once more, the rhythm steady, relentless. They stayed that day without further words. Izzy cooked what little they had, cornbread too hard at the edges, beans from a tin, and coffee strong enough to burn through fatigue. Chayton ate in silence at the table, nodding once, perhaps out of courtesy. That night, when the sky turned violet and the first crickets began their thin music, Izzy sat on the porch. The air smelled of dust and distant rain. Martha slept inside, wrapped in the quilt she'd carried from town to town. From where she sat, Izzy could see the horizon, the ridges of blood mesa burning red against the dying light. She thought of the words she'd spoken that morning, "I was told you need a wife." They hung in her memory now like a ghost, foolish and exposed. Chayton appeared then, silent as the dusk itself. He carried a bucket of water and set it down near the porch rail. The shadows lengthened around them. "She's sick," he said quietly, glancing toward the doorway. "Yes." Izzy's voice barely rose above the hum of insects. "But she'll mend. She always does." He didn't reply. His gaze followed the fading sun, his face unreadable. "You from the east?" "Farther," she said. "Past the salt plains. My father was a trader. He died in a winter storm." After a long silence, Chayton nodded. "Storms take what they want." He started to turn away, but she found herself asking, "Why do you live out here alone?" For the first time, something flickered behind his eyes, not anger but memory. "Because quiet don't lie," he said simply. "People do." He left her with that, disappearing again into the dusk. The sound of his boots on the porch boards faded, leaving only the rustle of wind through dry grass. Izzy sat a long while after he'd gone, her mind turning in slow circles. The air cooled around her shoulders and she realized the stars had begun to appear, one by one like old promises remembered. Inside, her mother stirred and coughed. Izzy rose, smoothed the blanket over her, and lay down beside her on the floor. She could smell cedar and ash, the faint trace of the man who'd let them stay. When sleep finally came, it was shallow and restless. She dreamed of open fields and thunderheads rolling over the mesa, of running water she could never quite reach. At dawn, she woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Through the open window, she saw Chayton leading a horse toward the creek. The animal's mane caught the early light like fire. He moved with quiet strength, patient and precise, the same rhythm she'd seen in the swing of his axe. Martha still slept, her breath shallow but steady. Izzy rose, pushed her hair from her face and stepped outside barefoot. The morning air was cool, laced with the scent of sage. She hesitated, then called out, "Do you need help?" Chayton turned, studying her for a moment. Then he handed her the reins. "Hold him steady." She did. The horse stamped once, then stilled under her touch. Her pulse quickened. For the first time in months she felt useful. When he finished at the creek, tightening the cinch, Chayton looked at her again, not with pity this time but something quieter, almost recognition. "You work hard," he said. "I try," she answered. He nodded once. "Then maybe you can stay a while longer. Till your mother's strong again." The wind rose softly across the fields, carrying the sound of distant bells from the church in Coyote Bend, faint and far like memory itself. Izzy looked toward the horizon, where sunlight broke in thin gold lines through the clouds. She didn't thank him. She only met his gaze, steady and wordless. Somewhere between the dust and the bells, a change had begun, small, fragile, but real. And behind them, the first shadow of a summer storm gathered over Blood Mesa. Morning settled over the ranch like a soft breath, pale light spilling across the cedar beams and dusted floorboards. The air carried the scent of damp horses, wood smoke, and wild sage that grew in stubborn clusters near the fence line. Izzy woke to the creak of wind against the window shutters and the quiet rasp of her mother's breathing. Martha slept curled beneath a faded quilt, her thin shoulders rising in frail rhythm. Outside, there was no church bell, no clamor of town, only cicadas and the distant whisper of river reeds bending in the breeze. Chayton was already outside, his shadow stretching long across the ground as he stacked cutwood beside the stable. He worked with the same measured stillness he spoke with, as though every action were a prayer whispered to the land. Izzy stepped outside barefoot, the porch cool beneath her toes, and watched the smoke from his morning fire snake into the sky. She murmured a quiet greeting. He simply nodded, not unkindly, and returned to stacking timber. By mid-morning, she had filled buckets at the well and scrubbed the kitchen table until it no longer held the sticky trace of dust and oil. She was not practiced at domestic work, but she moved with determined hands, as though order might earn them a place to stay. Chayton ate the breakfast she burned, eggs crisp on the edges, biscuits too dense, without a word of complaint. Martha sipped her tea with trembling fingers and whispered as though confessing a secret. "This house feels safer than any church." The silence within the walls was not cold. It was thick like a wool blanket, scratchy, heavy, and strangely comforting. In it, Izzy began to notice small things. The way Chayton always left the front window slightly open at night for the wind to pass through. The way he knelt before tying his horse's bridle, pressing his forehead briefly to the animals. She wondered whom he had learned that from. His mother, perhaps, or a people mostly gone. Word of their presence on his land carried quickly to town. By the third day, whispers slipped through the cracks of Coyote Bend like dust. Some said she had thrown herself at him. Others claimed he had bought her. At the church well, two women muttered loud enough for Izzy to hear, "Shame sits lighter on some." She did not answer. She only lowered her eyes and filled her water pail until her arms ached. At dusk that same day, she returned to the ranch with the sound of distant laughter still ringing like a bruise inside her chest. Chayton was sitting on the porch, sharpening a knife with slow strokes across a whetstone. His shirt was unbuttoned, dark hair falling past his shoulders. The cicadas sang as the sun bled into the horizon. Izzy stood at the edge of the steps, dust clinging to her skirt, and did not speak. "You let them say what they said?" he asked quietly, not lifting his eyes. Her throat tightened. "They wouldn't have listened if I argued. You don't owe them your silence. And I don't owe them my shame," she whispered, surprising herself. He looked at her then, really looked, and something softened in his expression like ice beginning to thaw. "Eat," he said instead, rising and nodding toward the door. Inside, Martha was sewing a tear in one of his shirts, her fingers slow but sure. She smiled faintly when she saw Izzy. They ate stew that tasted of pepper and ash. No one mentioned the town. Days slipped forward, stitched together by work and the low hum of quiet understanding. Izzy learned the ranch's rhythms. When the horses grew restless before storms, how the wind shifted before sundown, how Chayton's mood could be read by the way he untied his hair, tightly when troubled, loosely when calm. She rose before dawn, fetched water, and mended saddle straps with clumsy determination. At times, she caught him watching her, not with desire nor pity but curiosity, as though he could not yet decide whether she would break or hold. One evening, while Martha napped by the hearth, Izzy found him in the barn restringing a bridle. The air smelled of hay and warm leather. Lantern light cast amber across his skin, highlighting the faded scars that marked his back like thunder strikes. She lingered at the doorway, afraid to intrude. "You can come in," he said without turning. She stepped forward. "I want to learn," she said. "To help properly. Not just with pots and firewood." His hands paused on the leather strap. He glanced her way. "These tasks are not gentle. Your hands will bleed. They already do." For a long moment he said nothing. Then he handed her the end of the bridle. "Hold here." Firm. Their fingers brushed, brief and warm. It felt like the first honest kindness she had received in months. Martha's cough worsened as summer deepened. Some mornings she could not rise without help. Izzy pressed cool cloths to her mother's brow, whispered old lullabies into her hair, and tried not to let her voice tremble. Chayton spoke even less on those days but would leave small things by their door. Fresh peaches from a neighbor's orchard, willow bark tea for fevers, a new pair of boots he had cleaned until the leather gleamed. He never mentioned them aloud. Acts of care, quietly offered and never owed. Nights brought winds that rattled the shutters and carried the scent of distant rain. Thunder grumbled on the horizon though no storm yet crossed the plains. Izzy often lay awake on the cot beside her mother, listening to the house breathe around them. Once, unable to sleep, she stepped quietly onto the porch. Chayton stood there, leaning against the railing, eyes fixed on the dark line of Blood Mesa. "You should rest," he said without looking at her. "I can't. The wind is unsettled tonight. So am I." He turned then, and the lamplight from inside touched the edge of his face. "You don't have to be afraid here." "I'm not afraid of this place," she said softly. "I'm afraid it won't last." His brow furrowed, but before he could reply, the coyotes began their mournful howling beyond the hills. He looked back toward the sound. "All things change," he murmured. "But some things are worth holding while they do." The days stretched, but not aimlessly. There was a stillness that felt less like silence and more like soil, waiting, fertile, ready to grow something if only tended. The distrust between them eased into a quiet companionship, the kind built not from words but from shared labor and unspoken resilience. Even Martha noticed, though she said nothing. She only watched them with tired, knowing eyes. On the 12th evening, clouds gathered thick and purple over the ridge. Lightning stitched the far-off sky, silent and brief. Izzy was bringing in the wash from the line when she saw a rider approaching from the direction of Coyote Bend. Dust trailed behind his horse like smoke. As he drew nearer, she recognized the shape of Sheriff Beauregard Flint, his coat pinned with a star that glinted in the dying light. Chayton stepped from the barn, wiping his hands on a cloth, his expression already turning to stone. Flint pulled his horse to a halt. His eyes flicked to Izzy, then to the house behind her, where the faint glow of lamplight silhouetted Martha's fragile form through the curtain. He tipped his hat, though his voice held no courtesy. "Evenin'. I won't stay long," he said. But word's spreading fast in town. "Folks think something improper's brewing out here." Izzy's stomach dropped. Chayton said nothing. Flint continued, quieter now. "I don't care what's true. But some men in town, men with guns and pride, plan to find out for themselves. Soon." Lightning flashed again, closer this time, splitting the sky above Blood Mesa. Then thunder answered. The days that followed Sheriff Flint's warning felt longer than summer had any right to be. The air hung thick with waiting, the kind of tension that made even the horses restless. Wind carried the dry smell of heat and coming storm. The hills shimmered beneath the noon sun, their outlines wavering like something seen through tears. Each morning, Izzy woke to the sound of Chayton's boots on the porch and her mother's shallow breathing beside her. Two rhythms that had come to define safety, however fragile. Martha's cough worsened. It came in deep, rattling fits that left her trembling and gray. Izzy tried willow bark tea, cool compresses, whispered prayers. Nothing eased it for long. Chayton rode to town for the doctor, leaving before sunrise and returning past dusk. Dust streaked his skin and blood darkened the bandage on his arm where the sheriff's men had stopped him on the road. For a chat, they said, though the bruises told a different story. He said nothing of it, but Izzy saw the way his jaw set tighter than before. That night, as Martha slept fitfully, Izzy found him outside repairing a broken fence post. Lantern light gilded his shoulders, and the scent of fresh-cut cedar mixed with smoke from the fire pit. "You shouldn't have gone alone," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Would have been worse if I brought you. Men like them, they see what they want to see. I'm tired of being something for men to see." His hands paused on the hammer. Then softly, "You're more than that. But they won't see it. Not yet." The silence between them wasn't empty, it was heavy, full of all the things neither dared name. The horses stirred nearby, hooves shifting in the dirt, as if echoing a truth the night itself couldn't hold. When the doctor came the next day, his face was drawn and his voice practical. "Her lungs are near spent," he said, shaking his head over Martha's bed. "She's got maybe weeks if the fever don't take her sooner. Keep her cool, keep her still." He left without taking the coins Izzy tried to offer. "The Lord doesn't bill the dying," he muttered, stepping into the sunlight. Martha slept more often than she woke. When she did, her eyes wandered the room as though she'd forgotten where she was. But sometimes, when the fever eased, she'd smile faintly and whisper, "This house feels like it remembers love." Izzy would nod, pretending not to cry, and smooth her mother's hair back from her damp brow. Outside, the sky began to turn strange. Each evening, dark clouds rolled down from the mesas, pressing low, heavy with the promise of rain that never came. The heat built instead, trapped beneath the unbroken sky until even the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Chayton worked longer hours, fortifying fences, cleaning the stables, repairing the barn roof, always with that same quiet resolve, as though bracing himself for something larger than weather. One afternoon, Izzy found him standing near the corral, watching smoke rise from the horizon. "Brush fire," he said when she approached. "Could be lightning, could be men. Either way, it's moving north. Will it reach us?" He shook his head. "Not yet. But wind shifts fast in these canyons." That night the wind did shift. It came from the south, hot and sharp with the scent of burning wood. Izzy woke to the faint crackle of flames and the stinging taste of smoke. Chayton was already on his feet, hauling water from the well, shouting for her to get her mother outside. The barn was glowing red along the edges, fire licking through dry hay like hungry tongues. She pulled Martha's frail body from the bed, coughing as smoke filled the house. The older woman's feet dragged, breath ragged. Outside the world was orange and trembling. Sparks spun in the air like frantic stars. Chayton ran into the barn, face half lit by flame. The horses screamed, thrashing in their stalls. Izzy could hear him shouting, low guttural commands, and then the crack of splintering wood. "Chayton," she screamed. He burst through the smoke moments later, one arm wrapped around the neck of a terrified mare, the other gripping the reins of two others he'd managed to free. His hair was singed, his chest streaked with soot, but he didn't slow. He drove the horses toward the creek and turned back toward the flames. "Stay with her," he shouted over the roar. But she didn't listen. She ran after him, snatching up a bucket. They moved together, rhythm forged from panic, water, breath, flame, again and again. Her arms shook from the weight. Sparks kissed her skin, tiny burning mouths. Still she kept going. When the wind shifted again, it drove the fire back into the barn's heart, and Chayton grabbed her, dragging her away just before the roof gave. The crash shook the ground. A rush of heat swallowed the air, and then the night filled with silence so complete it hurt. They collapsed near the creek, coughing, lungs raw. Smoke trailed upward like ghosts retreating into the stars. The barn was gone. Only embers remained, flickering weakly against the dark. Izzy turned to him, saw the blood streaking his arm. "You're hurt." "Not bad." She tore a strip from her skirt and pressed it against the wound. Her hands trembled. He didn't flinch. For a moment, their faces were close enough for her to see the faint scar above his lip, the sweat cutting paths through soot on his cheeks. The world had burned down around them, yet in that fragile stillness, something unspoken passed between them. A recognition not of salvation but of shared ruin. Martha's weak voice broke the spell. "Izzy?" They turned. She stood near the porch, shivering, smoke curling around her like fog. Her eyes, though glassy, held clarity. "It's gone, isn't it?" Izzy nodded, tears cutting clean lines down her face. Chayton rose slowly. "We'll rebuild," he said. Martha smiled faintly. "You sound like a man who still believes in tomorrow." "I do," he said. "But I've learned not to expect it." In the days that followed, ash coated everything. The sky dimmed with smoke, turning the sun to a dull copper coin. Izzy worked beside Chayton, hauling charred wood, salvaging what little had survived. Her hands blistered, split, bled, and healed again. She said little, but the silence between them had changed. It no longer separated, it bound. At night, she washed his burns with cool water, her fingers moving gently over his skin. He never thanked her aloud, but his eyes did. Sometimes he'd sit outside afterward, carving shapes from cedar with a small knife. Once he handed her one, a hawk with wings half unfurled. "It's not finished," he said. "Like most things worth keeping." She turned it in her hand, tracing the imperfect lines. "It's beautiful. It's real," he murmured. The fire drew the attention of the town. Men rode out to inspect the damage, though their sympathy felt thin as paper. Izzy overheard them near the fence, words soaked in scorn. "Maybe the fire was a sign," one said. "God's way of warning him about keeping a white woman under his roof." The other laughed. If she weren't so pretty, no one cared. She wanted to shout, to claw the air with the fury building inside her. But when she turned toward the house, she saw Chayton standing in the doorway, watching them with eyes as calm and distant as stone. He didn't speak. The men left under that gaze, their laughter swallowed by wind. That night, the fever took hold of Martha again. Her body shivered despite the heat. Izzy sat beside her, wiping her brow, whispering stories from their past, of cold winters and the first wildflowers that grew behind their old home. Near dawn, Martha's hand found hers, trembling. "You've grown strong, Izzy. Stronger than I ever was." "Don't talk like that, Mama." Martha smiled faintly, eyes bright with some inner light. "That man, he's got a lonely heart same as yours. Don't let shame or gossip tell you you're less than him." Tears blurred Izzy's vision. "Rest, please." Her mother closed her eyes, still smiling. When Chayton entered later, Izzy was still sitting there, hand clasped around her mother's. "She's sleeping," she whispered. He looked at Martha, then at Izzy. "You should sleep too." "I can't." He hesitated, then placed a hand on her shoulder. The touch was light, unsure, yet it steadied her more than any prayer could. "You don't have to hold it all alone." She wanted to believe him. But the ache inside her was vast and old, deeper than fear. She turned to face him, and in her eyes he saw not fragility but fire. "You think kindness is enough to keep them away?" she asked quietly. "No," he said. "But it's enough to keep me human." Lightning flared again outside, white against the smoke-dark sky. For an instant, his face glowed, all sharp lines and worn grace. Izzy reached out, brushing her fingers over his bandaged arm. "Then maybe I'll learn from you," she whispered. He didn't answer, only met her gaze, steady, wordless, a promise without shape. Outside, thunder rolled over the mesa, closer than before. The wind picked up, scattering ashes across the yard. In the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. Then, faint but clear, came the sound of hooves, many moving fast. Chayton's head lifted, eyes narrowing toward the darkness beyond the ridge. Izzy followed his gaze. The horizon flickered, not with lightning this time, but with lanterns, dozens of them bobbing in the night like angry stars on the march. The wind carried a single voice, shouting across the distance. "Come out, Blackthorn." And the thunder answered again, louder. The night cracked open like a gunshot. The riders came over the ridge in a blaze of firelight and dust, their torches flaring orange against the black sky. Horses snorted, hooves struck rock, and the sound rolled down through the valley like a promise of ruin. Izzy stood in the doorway of the ranch house, heart pounding so hard it drowned out her breath. Beside her, Chayton's hand hovered near the rifle resting against the wall, though his eyes were calm, ancient calm like river stone that had weathered every flood. "They won't stop," Izzy whispered. "Not until—" "They'll stop when they've said what they came to say," he murmured, stepping forward. His voice carried the weight of thunder held in check. Lantern light flickered across his bare shoulders, over the faint sheen of sweat and ash. He looked like a man carved from the very land they wanted to erase. The horses drew closer, the riders' shouts turning into words, ugly and sharp. "Send her out," someone yelled. "We know what you're doing out here, savage." Another voice followed, higher and meaner. "Burned your own barn, didn't ya? Devil's tricks." Chayton's jaw flexed. "Get your mother inside," he said. "She's sleeping." "Then wake her, Izzy." But before she could move, a rifle cracked. The sound split the night. The bullet tore into the porch post, sending splinters scattering across her face. Chayton pushed her back, stepping in front of her, his silhouette haloed in torchlight. "Enough." His shout carried like a storm breaking loose. The echo rolled off Blood Mesa and back again, louder. The riders hesitated. Even rage had its moments of doubt. One of them, Beauregard Flint, his sheriff's star glinting beneath his coat, rode forward. "No trouble if there's no reason for it," he said, though his eyes burned with the same fever as the rest. "But folks in town don't like what they can't name. And what they're naming here ain't right." "She came here with her mother," Chayton said evenly. "That's all you need to know." Flint sneered. "And now the mother's dyin'. Town says maybe that ain't by God's hand, but by the devil's one. Apache medicine, Apache fire." Izzy stepped forward before fear could stop her. "My mother's dying because the world forgot mercy, not because of him. He saved us. You all would have left us in the dust." Flint's horse stamped, snorting. "You better watch that tongue, girl. You're talking to men who can make sure no one buries your kin proper." Chayton moved then, a single step, slow and deliberate. "You won't touch her," he said, voice low. Something in his tone made the air itself still. The men shifted uneasily. But anger breeds courage in fools. Another rider spat into the dirt. "Ain't no law protecting a red man and his whore." Izzy's breath caught. The words sliced through her like glass. Chayton's hand rose, faster than thought, lifting the rifle. The shot cracked like lightning, striking the torch from the man's hand. Flames spilled into the dirt, sputtering out in the wind. The riders reeled back, shouting, their horses twisting. Then chaos. Another shot fired, and another. Chayton pulled Izzy down behind the water trough as bullets tore splinters from the porch. The smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. Her hands clutched his arm, feeling the tremor of muscle under his skin. "They'll kill you," she gasped. "Not before they see what they've done." He leaned up, fired twice. One horse screamed, bolted. One rider fell hard, gun skittering across the dirt. But there were too many. Flint barked orders, "Flush him out." And men began circling wide. Inside the house, Martha's weak voice rose, calling Izzy's name. The sound tore her in two. "She's awake," Izzy said, trying to stand. Chayton grabbed her wrist. "Stay down. She's calling for me." A torch sailed through the air, spinning end over end, landing against the side wall of the house. Flames flared up, licking fast along the dry wood. Izzy broke free, running for the door. Smoke met her like a slap, thick and blinding. She could hear her mother coughing inside. "Mama?" She stumbled through the haze, found the bed, Martha's thin frame shaking beneath the blanket. "We have to go." Martha's eyes fluttered open. "Izzy, the light," she whispered. "It's beautiful." "No, please not now." Izzy dragged her toward the doorway, choking on the smoke. But when they reached it, Chayton was there, taking Martha into his arms as easily as if she were a child. He carried her out into the night, away from the flames as bullets hissed through the air. He laid her in the grass near the creek, out of reach of the fire's heat. Izzy fell beside her, coughing. Chayton turned, raising his rifle again, but Flint was already there, dismounted, gun in hand. "Enough!" Flint shouted. "You're done, Blackthorn." The world seemed to narrow to that moment. The torchlight, the shadows, the wet shine of blood at Chayton's temple where a bullet had grazed him. Izzy saw the sheriff's finger tighten on the trigger. She moved before she could think, grabbing the fallen pistol from the dirt. Flint's gun fired first. Chayton staggered, clutching his shoulder, but Izzy's shot followed, wild and desperate. The sound rang through the canyon like thunder splitting sky. Flint dropped, eyes wide in disbelief, blood darkening his shirt. For a heartbeat there was silence. Then the riders broke, panic rippling through them. Some fired into the air, some fled into the dark. The wind howled, scattering their torches, and rain began to fall, sudden, hard, washing over the flames still crawling up the ranch walls. Chayton sank to his knees, breath ragged. Izzy dropped beside him, pressing her hands to the wound in his shoulder. "You're all right. You'll be all right." His gaze lifted to hers, unsteady but clear. "You shouldn't have done that. I couldn't let you die." He gave a faint, pained smile. "Then we're even." Thunder rolled overhead, deep and endless. Rain streaked through the smoke, hissing against embers. When Izzy looked back toward the creek, she saw Martha lying still, her face peaceful in the rainlight. The world seemed to tilt, sound slipping away. "Mama?" she whispered. "No." Chayton touched her hand, his own trembling. "She's gone with the storm," he said softly. Izzy bowed her head, tears mixing with rain. For a long time, there was only the rhythm of water against earth, the hiss of dying fire, the slow pulse of loss. When dawn came, it was gray and quiet. Smoke hung low over the valley, curling like memory. The ranch was half burned but standing, blackened timbers reaching skyward like prayer. Chayton sat on the porch, shoulder bound in linen, carving wood with one unsteady hand. Izzy buried her mother beneath the cottonwood by the creek, the soil dark and soft from the rain. She marked the grave with Martha's shawl, tied to a branch that fluttered gently in the breeze. The townsfolk came 2 days later. They found the sheriff's body buried beside the road, wrapped in his own coat. They saw the burned house, the blackened barn, the graves. And something in them shifted, not remorse perhaps, but recognition of what they had done. The pastor came quietly that evening, hat in hand. "No one will bother you again," he said, voice low. "The town's done with this." Chayton only nodded. "The land remembers. That's enough." When he left, Izzy stood beside the creek, watching the water run clear again. Chayton joined her, his arm in a sling, movements slow but sure. For a while they said nothing. The world was new in its silence, emptied, yet strangely full. "She loved this sound," Izzy said finally. "Said it was the earth forgiving itself after the storm." Chayton glanced toward the horizon, where the clouds were breaking apart, sunlight spilling through like gold dust. Maybe she was right. Izzy turned to him. His face, worn and scarred, looked softer now, the hard lines eased by exhaustion and something gentler. Without speaking, she took his hand. His fingers closed around hers, warm despite the cold wind. They stood that way until the light changed, until the sky shifted from bruised gray to soft blue. The burned smell lingered, but beneath it came the scent of wet earth, of something beginning again. At last Izzy said, "What happens now?" Chayton's gaze followed the flow of the creek, its endless curve toward the mesa. "We build," he said simply. She nodded, and for the first time in years, hope felt less like a dream and more like a promise. As the morning sun broke over the ridges, catching the wet grass in a shimmer of gold, Izzy lifted her face to the light. Behind her, the cottonwood leaves rustled, whispering her mother's name. Beside her, Chayton's steady breath filled the silence between thunder and peace. And though the storm had passed, its echo lived on in them both. A reminder that sometimes when the world burns everything you've known, what remains isn't ruin but the soul, newly tempered, shining beneath the ash. Somewhere far off, a single church bell rang, carried on the clean wind, a sound not of sorrow this time but of grace.